You are sitting in a city right now. Maybe you are in an apartment. Maybe a house. Maybe a cafe with glass walls and electric lights humming above your head. You have running water. You have roads. You have a government, a currency, a postal system, and a phone in your pocket that connects you to a billion other people. You call this normal. But here is the thing. Every single person who ever lived inside a great civilization thought exactly the same thing. The Roman citizen walking the marble streets of the Forum thought his world was permanent. The Mesopotamian merchant counting his grain in the shadow of a ziggurat believed his city would stand forever. The Maya astronomer mapping the stars from a limestone temple had no idea that within a few generations, the jungle would swallow everything he had ever built. They were all wrong, and the pattern that destroyed them is not as ancient as you think. Historian Arnold Toynbee spent decades studying the rise and fall of 26 civilizations across human history. His conclusion was not what most people expect. Civilizations, he argued, are not destroyed from the outside, they are destroyed from the inside. The barbarians at the gate are never the real cause. They are only the final chapter of a story that the civilization itself began writing long before they arrived. So what actually kills a civilization? Start with the ground beneath its feet. In 2019, archaeologist Emily Hammer and her research team published findings on the ancient city of Ur, located in what is now southern Iraq. Ur was once one of the most powerful cities on Earth. Around 2000 BC, its population was estimated at 65,000 people, making it arguably the largest city in the world at that time. It had towering temples, written legal codes, poetry, mathematics, and trade routes stretching thousands of miles in every direction. Then, it emptied. The reason was not invasion, it was not plague, it was salt. Thousands of years of intensive irrigation had slowly drawn salt minerals to the surface of the surrounding farmland. The process was invisible at first. But crops began to fail. Wheat disappeared from the fields first. Then, barley, which tolerates salt far better, began to thin out and die. The food supply fractured quietly, almost invisibly, season by season, year by year. By the time the crisis became obvious to the people living inside it, the damage was already irreversible. The city did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It simply, slowly, stopped being able to feed itself. And then it stopped. This is the first pattern. Environmental exhaustion. Civilizations consume and degrade the very land and resources that sustain them. They rarely see it happening until it is already too late to stop. But there is a second pattern. And it is more dangerous because it happens entirely in the mind. Sociologist Joseph Tainter published a book in 1988 titled The Collapse of Complex Societies. His central argument was precise and deeply uncomfortable. As civilizations grow, they add layer after layer of complexity to solve the problems they encounter. More administrators to manage more people, more soldiers to defend longer borders, more infrastructure to move more goods across more territory, more officials to oversee more officials. Each new layer of complexity costs energy and resources to build and maintain, and each new layer delivers less benefit than the previous one did. Tainter called this diminishing marginal returns on complexity. At a certain point, the civilization is spending enormous resources simply to remain where it is. It is running faster just to stand still. Every new crisis requires a new bureaucratic solution. Every new solution adds more weight to an already strained system. And when a sudden shock arrives, whether drought, a new enemy, or a collapse in trade, there is no spare capacity left anywhere in the structure. The civilization has no room to adapt. The complexity that was supposed to protect it becomes the very thing that makes it too rigid to survive. You can trace this clearly through the final century of the Western Roman Empire. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was maintaining frontier fortifications stretching across thousands of miles of borderland. It was funding enormous professional armies. It was subsidizing grain supplies for urban populations across the empire. It was administering provinces spread across 3 continents. The tax burden on ordinary Roman citizens climbed year after year. The currency was repeatedly debased, causing inflation to erode savings and trade. The administrative machinery kept expanding, consuming more resources, while the actual productive strength of the empire quietly hollowed out beneath it. Historian Peter Heather, in his detailed reconstruction of Rome's final decades, makes the case clearly. The empire did not collapse because the Germanic tribes suddenly became more powerful or more organized. It collapsed because Rome had already exhausted its ability to respond to pressure. When the external force finally came, the internal structure had nothing left to give. The last push from outside only finished what the inside had already begun. Now here's the part that surprises almost everyone. Collapse is not always loud. It does not always announce itself. The Maya civilization did not end with a single catastrophic battle or a single devastating year. Between roughly 800 and 1000 C, the great southern lowland cities, among them Tikal, Palenque, and Copan, were gradually, quietly abandoned. Populations dispersed into smaller settlements. Monumental construction halted. The ruling dynasties dissolved without a formal surrender. Researcher David Webster at Penn State University spent years piecing together what happened. The picture that emerged was a combination of prolonged drought cycles, escalating warfare between competing city-states, and severe deforestation that stripped the thin tropical soil of its fertility. No single king gave up. No single army declared victory. The civilization simply unwound, city by city, across 2 slow centuries. People kept living. They kept farming. They kept having children and building smaller homes. They simply stopped building temples. They stopped recording dates. They stopped maintaining the enormous administrative structure that had once organized their world. The civilization dissolved. The people did not. And this distinction is the most important thing to understand, because it changes how you read what came after. Collapse, in the historical record, is not always the end of a story. Sometimes it is the clearing of a stage. Archaeologist Susan Sherratt and others who study the Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BC, which destroyed the Hittite Empire, severely damaged Egypt, and erased dozens of palace economies across the eastern Mediterranean, have noted something unexpected in the centuries that followed. New cultures emerged in the power vacuum. Trade reorganized along different routes. Early Greek civilization found room to develop in the space left behind by the fallen palace systems. Destruction cleared the ground. And in the cleared ground, something new eventually grew. Toynbee described this as the challenge and response dynamic at the heart of all civilizations. A civilization that can still respond creatively to pressure will survive and transform itself. A civilization that has lost the capacity to respond will fracture and dissolve. The pressure itself is never the deciding factor. The deciding factor is always whether the system is still flexible enough to meet it. So, what does any of this mean for you? You live inside a civilization right now, and your civilization carries several of the same measurable patterns that researchers have identified across every collapse in the historical record. Environmental stress accumulating on the systems that produce food and fresh water. Growing administrative complexity that costs more each decade to sustain while returning less to ordinary people. Political fragmentation between groups that no longer share a common language for solving shared problems. A widening distance between those who manage the system and those the system was built to serve. None of this makes collapse inevitable. Tainter himself is careful to say that. Civilizations have adapted before. The Byzantine Empire survived for nearly 1,000 years after the western half of Rome fell, precisely because it simplified its structure, shed complexity it could no longer afford, and reorganized around what it could still sustain. But the patterns are not invisible. They are readable. They have been read before, written in the abandoned grain stores of in the vine-covered plazas of Tikal, in the silent forums of cities that were once the center of the known world. The Roman citizen walking those marble streets believed his world was permanent. You are walking your own version of those streets right now, and the question that every collapsed civilization failed to ask in time is the same quiet question sitting underneath everything you call normal today. How long can a system this complex keep running before it costs more than it creates? The ruins do not answer, but they prove, without exception, that it was always the right question to ask. There is one more thing worth sitting with. Every civilization that has ever collapsed left behind people who did not understand what had happened to them. They were not stupid, they were not weak, they were simply too close to the structure to see the structure. The Roman farmer in the 5th century did not think of himself as living through a collapse. He thought he was living through a difficult decade. The Maya villager walking away from Tikal did not think of himself as abandoning a civilization. He thought he was moving somewhere better. The perspective that makes collapse visible requires a distance that no one living inside the moment ever has. What you can do, and what distinguishes every civilization that managed to adapt rather than dissolve, is look at the patterns. Name them, measure them, take them seriously before the pressure arrives rather than after it does. The civilizations that survived their crises were not the ones with the most power or the most territory. They were the ones that retained the ability to question the systems they had built. That asked whether the complexity was still serving the people or whether the people had begun serving the complexity. That question is as old as the first city ever built, and it has never stopped being the right one.